Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah, we have been given another opportunity by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to meet on the air in the program Man and Nature, produced by Hajah Maslina binti Alias. As I mentioned last week in our first episode of the new season of Man and Nature, our focus for these first few weeks will be on managing disasters. Last week, I talked about the Islamic perspective on disaster, and perhaps we can begin by recapping briefly. There are three ways in which Islam views disaster. First, it is an act of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, whereby disasters will only occur if Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala wills it to take place. Second, disasters are trials or tests on mankind in order to elevate our standing in the sight of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And third, disasters also serve as warnings to those who disobey Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Ladies and gentlemen, in this week's episode of Man and Nature, we will continue with our discussion on disasters. And for this, I am not alone today, as I am joined by our special guest, Dr. Kamarul Azahari Razak, Director, Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Center, or DPPC, at the Malaysia-Japan International Institute of Technology, MJIIT, at the University Technology Malaysia, UTM. Dr. Kamarul Azahari holds a PhD from Faculty of Geosciences, Utrecht University, the Netherlands, in the field of geomatics engineering, and has been involved in the area of disaster preparedness and prevention for a good number of years. He'll be sharing with us today on the topic 5 strategies to build a culture of resilience. First and foremost, Assalamualaikum, Dr. Kamarul.
Waalaikumsalam.
Welcome to Radio IKIM, and thank you for agreeing to be our guest on Man and Nature.
Thank you for the invitation.
Right, Dr. Kamarul, perhaps to start off our discussion, it's only appropriate, I think, if we begin with you sharing some background on your center, namely the Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Center, or DPPC.
Baik, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum and very good day. Thank you, Dr. Sheikh, for the introductions and Hajah Mas. Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Center, DPPC, it was established back in 2015 after the two government, Malaysian government and Japanese governments met in Sendai after the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. And it was basically aims to provide a research center at the national level, and also giving more opportunity and platforms for 3 model. First, on the academic program. Second, on the research high impact program, and the third on the how we translate research into practice by engaging the community program. So under these 3 major pillars, we have been surviving the last 7 years, and hopefully we'll be supporting for the next 7 years to go to support the 2030 global agenda, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, Doctor, could you tell us about the current scenarios of disaster in Malaysia, regional impact of climate change, and its cascading results at a local level?
Yes, indeed. That's one of our vision and mission as DPPC was established under Malaysia-Japan International Institute of Technology. We look into how basically we can learn technology, knowledge and best practice from Japan. By looking at our current scenarios, it's scary basically. And if we compare the statistic of the numbers of losses, human losses and economic losses from 2014 floods and 2021 floods, there are about 220% increment in terms of the human losses and economic losses. This figure is scary in the sense that every time we have been facing a similar scale of disaster, the numbers of casualties increase, and those who are losing the houses, infrastructures and assets have difficulty to return back as before even some of them have difficulty to bounce back better. By looking at the current climate change pattern, some of the disasters are localized. We have seen numbers of new cascading hazard, we call it, like what happened in Yan on the 18th of August 2021. Last year in July in Baling, and December 2021 in Hulu Langat, in some places in Pahang as well. So these are new types of disaster are coming as a result of the extreme weather event. And if we recall back on the 18th of December 2021, it was basically driven by a Typhoon Rai, which was warned by Met Malaysia on the 16th of December. So it took us about 2 days basically to prepare, but we never thought that the scale of the impact are higher than expected. So given the current scenarios of our climates, hopefully we can strengthen our risk governance and also our preparedness, inshallah.
Inshallah. Now, as mentioned earlier, our topic for discussion is 5 strategies to build a culture of resilience. Perhaps, Doctor, you can share with our listeners what these strategies are and why they are important to build a resilient culture in view of our changing climate, systemic risk, and also prevailing impacts.
Sure, Doctor. Yes, indeed. There are 5 major strategies, and I've been working on these strategies based on several case studies, ranging from flooding induced by riverine, by large dams, as well as by other types of disaster in Malaysia in the last 20 years. First of all, I think we have to invest into the technology by looking at risk assessment. We have to improve the way we map, knowing the level of risk, and also assessing the vulnerability. So the first key strategies is on the risk assessment. It has to be driven by the modern and advanced technology. Number 2, we have to invest into our risk governance. We have, of course, definitely, we have our directive MKN20, but it is not enough since the cycle of the disaster before, during, and after require a full transformation. And we have to strengthen our local risk governance. Since in the last 20 years, we have seen the records, most of the disaster are very localized. We have to enhance our local capacities of our disaster managers at the local level. So risk assessment, risk governance, and the third one, before I hand over, the risk communication. We have to invest into the new technology on how we disseminate, how we forecast, and improve our understanding of the future risks. So risk communication is very critical in the sense that to what extent basically we predict the disaster, and to what extent we disseminate at the right time for the right target. So these 3 perhaps lead to the formulations of the 5 best strategies.
Okay, to recap, the first 3 are invest in technologies based on risk assessment. Second is invest in local risk governance. And third is invest in risk communication. So what are the other 2 strategies?
Yes. By looking at these 3 strategies, it requires a huge investment by the government. And it's not only on the government alone. We can also invite other stakeholders from private sector. So I call it as a risk investment. So these risk investments across sectors, from public, private, academia, and also civil society, they have to come on board and invest in terms of resources, energy, expertise, and as well as financial capacity. And the last one, and how these 4 risks risk assessment, risk governance, and risk investment, risk communication will help us to build a culture of resilience. So the last one, how we not only think of risk, but how we better switch our focus from risk to resilience. So the last one, risk to resilience, require a lot of commitments from different level of societies.
Could you give some examples, perhaps, to these 5 strategies to better illustrate how important these strategies are to be implemented in our society?
Indeed. If we recall back on the 18th of December 2021, I'm one of the ESCOS members to Mercy Malaysia. We have seen many academic society or communities basically doing a lot of research. But during the calamities, basically you can also translate some of your research into practice. An example, in Hulu Langat, I was dispatched to the field together with Mercy Malaysia, our volunteers. We have seen a lot of damage, a lot of losses, and how best basically we improve the understanding of locals. So we use technology to map out all the damage in the Sungai Lui area, and we look into what best actually data speak in terms of the rapid recovery in the area. By showing the field evidence, basically we attract a lot of funding, from the foundation, from other resources, a part of the public donation. So we have NGOs, academia, and we have public and private sectors come together, look into one goal is to reduce the risk and impact so that the people will bounce better and faster. That's our mission. So this Hulu Langat is going to be declared as a living lab, in the sense that people can come and learn practically how basically these concepts and these 5 strategies has been abandoned. Hulu Langat is just one example. And if I switch quickly to 2015 Sabah earthquakes, 30 seconds of shaking, it cost us about 2.84 billion USD
In damage.
And some of the damage you can felt until now. People are still recovery, but through a series of transformations, we have improved the local resilience, built what we call it as a local champion. So we empower the local communities to take in charge of the recovery and mitigation. So we have seen this trend and pattern by empowering, investing into localization. It helps a lot. So it's not only the burden of the government, but also the other sectors as well.
Okay. Doctor, perhaps this is something that I just thought of. You mentioned about cooperation with the Japanese government. How much is it that we can learn from Japan in terms of, managing risks of disasters?
Yes, there are a lot. I think this one of the great example of the nation, how basically they instill the culture of resilience, even to their kids, how important to know the area, the level of risk, how to get the right information and so on. One of the secret recipe I learned from Japanese culture is about how every single of us have a role during calamities, before, during, and after disaster. So, say for example, in Malaysia we have about 75,000 academicians, scientists, researchers. Some of them have been doing research, publish a lot of journal and articles, and we were wondering how much basically the research being translated into practice. But in Japan, we have seen that some of the technology are practical enough to be understood by the local communities. That's number one. Number two, there are three major concepts. We call it as self-helps, mutual helps, and also public helps. Public helps, it come from civil defense, from police, from fire and rescue. These so-called mutual help coming from the neighbors. In 1995, there was a major earthquake in Kobe. 80%, well, about 6,000 plus people die because of these earthquakes. But 80% people, 80% of the survival are basically saved by the communities. Only remaining 20% of the survival helps by the government. So this major concept moving from public helps to mutual help, and later they invented into the self-helps. So every single of us have a roles and contribute a lot during the calamities. So this one of the few example how basically we learn the culture. Definitely their technology are quite advanced. Recently we bought a new system. We call it as S-band radar. It can measure every single droplet of rain before it reach to the ground.
I see.
So you can improve the forecasting and prediction so that you can have more lead time or preparation time for our disaster managers and the people.
That's very interesting. I was also involved with a research project with our Japanese counterparts from Kyoto University. One of the things that impressed me during one of the visits to Japan is the level of awareness and education given to the society.
Yes.
I think this also plays a role in creating resilience in the society, because
Definitely.
knowledge is a powerful tool, if you like. And one of the things I observe is that in almost every major city in Japan, they actually have a disaster education center.
Yes.
So this is something that I see not happening in Malaysia. So perhaps I can get some comments on you.
Yes, indeed. There are landslide museum. There's a earthquakes disaster center. So disaster education is part of their life. You know, understanding risks, getting the information. Last 5 weeks, I was in Tokyo. A new professor's moved to Tokyo. And he was showing me a maps. Whenever registered as a new resident, you get a maps. So on the maps, you can see where's the evacuation routes, you know, evacuation center. These are basic needs, which technically it derive from a level of knowledge, how basically the scientific technical knowledge translated into the layman. People can easily understand some of the warnings, some of the forecasting, and the level of knowledge also cascading down into the children's, you know, small kids also understand how important we carry out the drill, for example, and how much basically you have to know the basic survival for the next few days after the disaster.
I think that's very critical, because I notice in Malaysia we have this attitude that this is not going to happen here in the country.
Exactly.
So I think this requires a lot of mindset changing. And perhaps there is a need, for, at least from my point of view, for us to have disaster education centers to instill awareness and also knowledge. I think not many people know what to do, especially or what to do during floods.
Definitely.
Or what to do during landslides. In the past month alone, we have had landslide. We have also floodings in a number of states. I think awareness and education is really critical.
It is. We are talking about more than 7,000 landslide in our records right now, and 22,000 slopes that be monitored every year, and 10% of our total land are basically flood prone area. Almost 5 million people annually affected. So these numbers are increasing, and I hope that by investing into the disaster education, we can better prepare for the future risks, inshallah.
So moving on to the next question, perhaps Dr. Kamarul, you can highlight some key recommendations towards strengthening resilient societies across nexus.
Sure. First, I would like to look into how basically the policy. We have many policies and laws, definitely, but within the context of disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction in Malaysia, we need a new law, new regulation. That's number one. And definitely, National Disaster Management Agency has been working on it, and hopefully it will be finalized. By having a proper law, I think we can make a lot of change and transformation. That's number one. Number two, I think we have to look into how the decisions, or what we call it as a scientific based decision making process, all the decision must be made based on fact and figure. Some of the decisions should be made based on the field evidence. So this very critical in the sense that we have to invest into the digitalization, how basically the data from the dam in Kenyah will be communicated and transmitted quickly to Putrajaya, and how we disseminate to 30,000 people in Shah Alam and Kelang during the first 3 days after the major heat on the 18th of December, how basically we can better evacuate them properly. We are talking about mobilizing, evacuating 30,000 people within 3 days. We need the helps from the government, from the technology, and also from the decision support system. It must be intelligent enough. So these two, plus with 5 strategies, perhaps is the best ingredient at the moment, in the sense that we have to face a new cascading hazard, systemic risk, and also compound disaster in the future. Doctor,
do you see things getting worse in terms of disasters because perhaps because of the effects of climate change?
Definitely, it's not only about the climate change, about our urbanization. It's also increasing. The peoples who are building the new homes, new residential in the vulnerable area. This, it is a secret recipe for the future disaster. So we have to improve our prevention and also our preparedness, inshallah.
Okay. Perhaps, coming towards the end of our program, perhaps you have some concluding remarks that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Sure. First, I think we have to invest into risks. So these risks must be well understood, and to better understand about the level of risk, it must be quantitatively or objectively maps in the field. Then we require a lot of investments from different level of stakeholders, from public, private, academia, NGOs, and also individual parties. First. Second, I think if we can conclude here, we have seen a strong movements of the young professionals, young volunteers come to the field, helps the people, the victims. I've observed this in the last few years. It's a good trend how basically the people, especially the young, helps the victims in the field. And I would like to take this opportunity to encourage young people to join any non-governmental organization, whether you are aspirants, professors, lecturers. There are ways for you to contribute during the major calamities. So we have to better equip our knowledge so that we can help others peoples, inshallah.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Kamarul. Alhamdulillah, we have obtained quite a number of new information and knowledge regarding management of disasters, in particular in building a culture of resilience in our country. Being resilient is part and parcel of being prepared in facing possible disasters. And in this context, I think and I believe we can actually draw upon an example stated in the Quran regarding the famous story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, which is recorded in verses 47 to 49 of Surah Yusuf, which is translated as follows. Yusuf said, "For 7 years shall you diligently sow as is your wont, and the harvest that you reap, you shall leave them in the ear except a little, of which you shall eat. Then will come after that period 7 dreadful years, which will devour what you shall have laid in advance for them. all except a little which you shall have specially guarded. Then will come after that period a year in which the people will have abundant water and in which they will press the harvest. So the lesson from the story of Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam is the importance of being prepared in facing possible disasters in order for us to be resilient when disaster strikes. In the present context, Dr. Kamarul has shared with us 5 strategies needed in order to become a resilient society as well as a resilient country, which are, I think, very useful and important to be implemented. To recap, the 5 strategies are: invest in technologies based on risk assessment, invest in local risk governance especially, invest in risk communication, also the need to have investments in risk across sectors, public, private, academia, and also civil society. And finally, build a culture of resilience. So I think these 5 strategies are important for us to take note, and we can play our own role in making these 5 strategies a reality. I would like to record my sincerest gratitude to Dr. Kamarul Azhari Razak, Director of Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Center, DPPC, from MJIIT UTM, for joining me in Man and Nature this week. Inshallah, our discussion today has been very beneficial to everyone listening either on Radio IKIM or our Facebook page. Please share and forward this discussion with everyone so that we can make the benefits more widespread, inshallah. Thank you again, Dr. Kamarul.
Thank you.
Inshallah, we would like to have you again in the future to discuss
Inshallah.
more issues, especially pertaining to disaster preparedness and also prevention. And that's all the time that we have for today in Man and Nature. Next week, we will have another guest joining us to discuss on another dimension related to disasters. Who is our next guest and what is the topic? Stay tuned to Radio IKIM, especially Man and Nature, next week at the same time. Until we meet again, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.